So let's get back to where we left off there, where you were talking about stabilizing the organization. So describe sort of that process. After the first year, you stabilize the organization, and now what's next?
Well, we were kind of working some parallel paths. One of the things that we did during COVID was some of the engineering team had some ideas around improving some forecasting models and things like that. So one of the keys to having the materials on hand when you need them is forecasting what we call scrap rates. So when an engine comes in, there's a certain number of parts that, they're beyond repair, or they will time out, or they will have had other problems that create a need to scrap that part and replace it. And so the engineers had been working on some improvements to that modeling process, and they got pretty deep into that during COVID. And so one of the things they did, and they had AI engine involved, and ultimately got to where they had a much better predictability of scrap rates for an engine, and they also had the ability to do it much further out. They could take the operating parameters, the engine while it was still flying, and they're gathering all this data, and ultimately it's a dynamic model that continues to predict what the scrap rates are going to be right up to the day the engine comes into the shop. The other thing that we started to do in conjunction with that is we were, previously we treated the airline very much as like a fleet maintenance operation would treat the engine. So instead of being, engine specific, we were fleet specific. So we would take all 757 engines and we would say, this is the budget for the year. This is how many we expect to have to overhaul or repair. And we treat it, you'd have some winners and some losers, and you would manage it more like a fleet budget. And we shifted to a serial number specific management. And there were a couple of reasons for that. One was because of the supply chain disruptions, we needed to be able to see the flow of parts to each engine. And we actually needed to see that way in advance. So, the turn time for repair cycles prior to COVID was about 45 days. And it had turned into 150-day repair cycles for lots of parts. Because we don't do them all internally. A lot of them are done externally. And because of the new engines that were being produced, a lot of the OEMs and other avenues for repairing parts, they had so much other work around producing new parts for new engine types and everything else. So we had to be able to predict further out so that we could get ahead of the demand curve on the parts. And we had to also be able to start to channel parts to specific engines, way upstream of when the engine actually got here. And that required us to change some of the internal processes around how we operate with our planning systems and with our production management systems, and then starting to put into place, so that was all oriented around trying to get some stability around supply chain and material demand and all those types of things. We had all the training going on and trying to get stability around all of that element, and really get consistency and get some drumbeat, get some flow back into the shops. Even at a ridiculously high turn times, trying to get a stable life back in, a stable environment, I guess, back in the shop. And so we had to look at, and we really started to look at whip control, and we had shops that we always had max whip plans for every shop, but every shop was at max whip, and the engines just kept coming, and the whip just kept building. Yeah. And so we had to go into a little bit of a whip, drain the whip off, kind of drain the swamp approach to things to get some stability as well. And then once we started to get a bit stabilized, then we could start to look back at some of the traditional things we're used to working on with whip management and all of the tools that we go in and examine, what turn times are on various part repair and assembly functions, and just kind of getting back to some level of normal metrics and that kind of thing, even though they were still inflated.
Right. So that kind of leads into your whole continuous improvement effort. We've got new people trying to get them to understand the system